Good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Vikas Saini, president of the Lown Institute. Welcome all. I particularly want to thank our sponsors for this evening, this lovely evening. The Institute for Healthcare Improvement, Naseeb and Maureen Shamoon, Dr. David Bohr, Dr. Patty Gabow, and James Jocelyn. We are very grateful for your generous support, and we're delighted to have you here. First of all, I want to say you, all of you, honor us with your presence. A year ago, when Omicron was surging, I wasn't sure we'd be able to have this dinner. The pandemic certainly taught us and taught everyone how important it is for us to be together, to talk, to enjoy each other's company. But there's also another dimension, and if you'll permit me, the pandemic showed how important it is for there to be a public space, for there to be a commons. And by coming here this evening, in many ways, what we're doing is we're creating that important public space. We're creating a commons. And I'd submit to you this, what we're doing, is an essential civic activity. Now, when we do this, when we go beyond our own families, beyond our own neighborhoods or organizations, we're creating common values, and we're sharing and celebrating common values. So in my view, that's what we're doing tonight. We're creating a civic space to celebrate the best in us. Before the pandemic, I took this sort of gathering for granted. Now I see, as corny as it might sound, that this is how we weave together a civilized community. And that's how we're going to create the world that we all want to see. And that's an important reason why we all should be here. So thank you again for joining us for this. Enjoy your first course. I'll be back in a minute, but I'm just going to turn over the stage shortly to Zachary Lown. And I also want to let you know that if anybody wants to share their thoughts of Dr. Altaf Saadi, this year's winner of the Bernard Lown Award, we will have an opportunity after the dinner where we'll have some toasts and a microphone. So just so you're aware. So now I'd like to invite Zachary Lown up, Dr. Bernard Lown's grandson, to say a few words.
Thank you, Vikas. So I wanted to talk about, on the theme of values, what I saw as some similar values and sort of unifying themes between my grandfather and Dr. Saadi. So my grandfather, who was eating her salad. So my grandfather left his own country in Lithuania in 1935 to evade Nazi-led persecution. He came to this country, established himself as an immigrant and then a doctor. And he used medicine and his position as a doctor not just to heal individuals, but to attack social inequities on a number of fronts. And that ranged from civil rights to the Vietnam War to, of course, averting the threat of a nuclear catastrophe. Dr. Saadi's family evaded the oppressive regime of Saddam Hussein and moved to Iran. Tell me if I get it all right. Dr. Saadi was born at the tail end of the Iran-Iraq War, and she herself immigrated to Canada and later to the US. And here she committed herself to fighting inequities on a number of fronts, particularly as it relates to asylum seekers, immigrant health, and combating racial injustice. So I saw that theme immediately at the outset, this common thread of crossing borders and crossing boundaries, as well as a historical understanding as to the need for social action informed by personal experience. And that brings me to the second thing, which I thought that my grandfather sort of represented, that Dr. Saadi embraced and embodies, which is the physician's responsibility for social action. My grandfather used his Nobel acceptance speech as a call to action against what was then the ever-mounting threat of nuclear war and mass sudden death, as he called it. And at Oslo, he said the following: "We physicians have taken a sacred and ancient oath to assuage human misery and preserve life." And that quote for him was really sort of the first law or the first rule which he saw as the doctor's role, which extended from the individual to society. Our current period now, it seems to me, is sort of characterized by a conservative backlash, the mainstreaming of extremist and racist ideas, and the creation of an imagined enemy. And one of the things which my grandfather relied on was the moral authority of the doctor or the physician, and using that position. And he did sometimes contrast the moral authority of the physician with that of the lawyer, which was me. But he believed that the doctor could therefore use medicine and science to combat reactionary ideas. And just one example from Dr. Saadi's work in this line was her debunking the junk science behind a phony diagnosis called excited delirium, which police officers used to describe the people they arrested with, that they were arresting, essentially, in order to justify committing violence against them, and mainly black men. And her advocacy caused the leading medical societies to denounce use of the term and a major police department to retire it. She's done other work, which I think Vikas is going to talk more about, including as the MGH Asylum Clinic, her work with Physicians for Human Rights, and her building of community and physician partnerships, which was something else that my grandfather really cared about and valued. So we're honored to honor Dr. Saadi this year. We're very happy with the award, her as the award recipient, and we really sort of invite everyone to, hopefully this award kind of encourages or in some way helps further her work and what she's already doing. So thank you.
Thanks, Zach. Harvey Feinberg, who was the provost at Harvard, once said to me, "Bernard is the most integrated person I've ever known." And that really nails it. Dr. Lown's mind shuttled from art to science, from intellect to emotion, from specific technical matters to subtleties of clinical medicine, to family dynamics, to the social role of physicians, to the importance of public policy for moral objectives. And that integrated worldview is what made him really extraordinary. So at the Lown Institute, we're carrying on his legacy by focusing on bold ideas for a just and caring system of health in this country. We're seeking to provide leadership that contributes to that goal. But our view of leadership is different, and some of the rationale for it might sound presumptuous, maybe even a bit outrageous. But first of all, I don't think it's news to anybody here that our society has a lot of turmoil and that the social fabric is pretty frayed. There's definitely a declining sense of common purpose and even a conflict about the meaning of the common good. So Dr. Lown and I frequently had chats in his study, as I know there are several of you here who've also had that pleasure. One of the themes that kept cropping up was the idea that what we do as physicians in the exam room is so deeply, centrally human that it might be a kind of universal language that could unlock important doors. The great Roman poet Terence, roughly translated, said, "Nothing human is alien to me." And we clinicians understand that completely, I think maybe even instinctively. When someone comes to us sick or injured, We don't ask if they're a Democrat or a Republican. We don't ask if they're a capitalist or a socialist. As important as those tribal labels might be in other settings and contexts, when it's a matter of life and death, and even when it's just a matter of an illness in the midst of a full life, those labels are way in the background. What's in the foreground is our common humanity. Dr. Lown and I used to riff on that idea, and the idea that leadership that would be required to fix healthcare, to really fix it by reimagining the whole delivery system along the lines of what he pioneered in his clinic, a deeply personal, relationship-based model. In order for that kind of leadership to actually succeed, it would have to illuminate the things that all of us as Americans have in common. Otherwise, it would be hard to achieve it. And then we used to muse that maybe that same kind of leadership might well spark an even broader revival, a sense of the common good, and maybe even a healing of some of the divisions in our country. America has brilliant clinicians, great institutions, amazing research, and the best healthcare in the world for some. But really, there's no reason whatsoever that we couldn't have the best system of health for all. So at the Lown Institute, we have a vision for such a system where communities can flourish, health professionals can find joy, and our nation can grow stronger. But we know that to realize that vision, we're going to need a paradigm shift, a big shift, a shift away from the industrialization of care and towards more personalized, socially responsible care. Now, in times of turmoil like these, when paradigms are shifting beneath our feet and the old order is dying, but the new one hasn't yet been born, in these times, traditional forms of leadership really don't work. Instead, in these times, leadership has to be more adaptive, more willing to experiment, more willing to speak out, more willing to challenge norms, to prod people out of their comfort zones. And it usually comes from the young and from the grassroots. It's rarely, if ever, top down. Now, maybe Otto Bismarck would dispute that, but if we're going to create the world that we seek, we're going to need leadership of a very particular sort. And the Bernard Lown Award is meant to promote that idea of leadership. People who are willing to take risks and that are willing to state obvious truths that no one else is willing to say. That's why we're all here tonight. We're here to celebrate a different kind of leadership. This award was obviously totally inspired by Dr. Lown, who was kicked out of Johns Hopkins for desegregating their blood bank, who caused pandemonium at the Mass Medical Society meeting by getting his patients out of bed a few days after their heart attack rather than weeks and weeks later, and who caused outrage in Washington by partnering with Soviet doctors at the height of the Cold War to organize some simple truth-telling about the consequences of nuclear weapons for the people and for the planet. I should point out in all three cases, Dr. Lown's outsider view eventually became conventional wisdom. This is the second year of this award, and it's been really exciting to see how much interest has grown around it. We really weren't unsure how it would go when we first started, but we've gotten so many great nominations in just 2 short years. It's been astonishing. I know I speak for the entire nomination committee when I say we've been inspired by the work of all these young clinicians who are incredible wellsprings of hope. I sincerely mean it. It's been really something. They've certainly transformed my sense of what's possible and have really given me a whole new range of optimism than I had before. So today, I'm delighted to present the award to Dr. Altaf Saadi. Dr. Saadi, could you please come up and join me at the podium? Dr. Saadi graduated from Yale, where she earned the David Everett Chandler Award for Moral Character. She also won the Nakanishi Prize for Leadership in Race Relations. But what I just learned, I should also mention that while at Yale, during the commencement speech, she was the one person who held up the lonely sign denouncing the Iraq War during a speech by former Prime Minister Tony Blair. Dr. Saadi then graduated cum laude from Harvard Medical School and went on to complete a residency at the Mass General Neurology, and where she was selected as chief resident. So I think it's pretty clear and obvious that the selection committee saw the very same qualities in her that Dr. Lown possessed: an uncompromising, determined, and indefatigable spirit. As Zach pointed out, Dr. Lown and Dr. Saadi shared this experience of being uprooted and becoming immigrants into the United States. Yesterday, she and I were talking about being uprooted and what that means, how you're thrown into a brand new culture and a new language and a new society. It can be very disorienting. It can be really tough. But sometimes outsiders have the greatest insight into a society. They certainly have enormous sensitivity to what's universal in all of us all over the world. In other words, they sometimes have a particular sensitivity to the common good. In just 10 years after graduating med school, she's had an incredible impact. You heard some of it from Zach. She's changed the lives of hundreds of immigrants by helping them gain asylum and other forms of humanitarian relief through her leadership in the volunteering for the Physician Human Rights Network and the Mass General Hospital Asylum Clinic. She spearheaded the project Doctors for Immigrants, a website that provides resources for healthcare institutions to become more welcoming of immigrants. She's been a medical expert for human rights organizations, where she calls attention to abuse and poor conditions in immigration prisons. And she uses her platform regularly to speak out against injustice in all areas, including police violence and sexual assault. Dr. Altaf Saadi has everything that Bernard Lown admired: clinical skill, commitment, passion, eloquence. She's certainly a shining example of the kind of courageous and outspoken leadership that we're going to need if we're going to make our world a livable home for our children and our grandchildren. It is my great honor, privilege, and pleasure to present the 2023 Bernard Lown Award for Social Responsibility to Dr. Altaf Saadi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for being here. It's really incredible to see some familiar faces, so many new faces. Thanks to Dr. Mejia, who couldn't be here today, but for nominating me. I'm really grateful. Thank you to my husband, Samir, who has reminded me every day since I first got the call from Vikas that I am worthy of this. Thank you for being my forever cheerleader. And although they couldn't be here today, I also wanted to thank my parents. They are resilience embodied. And from whom I've inherited my moral compass. I'm really grateful to them. So following in the footsteps of Dr. Mona Hana Atisha, the inaugural recipient of this award, and Dr. Bernard Lown, its namesake, is no small challenge. Those are large shoes to fill. I'm honored to be in their remarkable company, and I promise to do my best to earn this award every day. Today, I wanted to share a little bit about how I became a doctor, some challenges I faced in my work, and how I countered those challenges. And I'm gonna begin in 2006. I was a student at Yale University. I walked into a pre-med study group for my organic chemistry class, and I was wearing a t-shirt that said, "Stop the genocide in Darfur." Another student looked up, she wrinkled her forehead at seeing my t-shirt, and she said, "Wait, what? There's a genocide going on in Darfur?" I would like to say this was the only encounter that I had like this as a budding doctor, but it wasn't. And now as a full-fledged doctor, I still receive reactions like this. When I was a medical resident, a colleague looked up at a patient's TV screen, saw masses of people in protest with headlines about Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and turned to me and asked, "Who's Michael Brown anyway?" We live in a world that seems inundated by crisis after crisis. The conflict in Darfur back in the early 2000s involved the ethnic cleansing and death of over 300,000 Darfurians in Sudan. Michael Brown was an 18-year-old boy who was shot and killed by the police officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson. The phrase, "hands up, don't shoot," that Michael Brown had uttered to Officer Wilson before he was killed quickly entered the lexicon of the growing Black Lives Matter movement. And there are so many other crises. Countries, cities, places, and names that garner wall-to-wall media attention. You will all recognize them. Yemen, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Uvalde, Pulse Nightclub, Sandy Hook Elementary School, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, George Floyd. There are so many more. But there's a crisis that doesn't garner headlines, and that's the crisis of collective indifference, particularly among those of us with the privilege to look away, to move on with our lives undisturbed and unbothered by the despair and agony of our brothers and sisters in humanity. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that the greatest tragedy is not the vitriolic words and other violent actions of the bad people, but the appalling silence and indifference of the good. Today, that indifference is often directed towards immigrants in the US, whether it's those fleeing persecution in their home countries and arriving at the US-Mexico border, or those who have lived in our communities for decades without any ability to obtain documented immigration status. In my work, I often meet with and evaluate immigrants who are imprisoned by our government pending the outcome of their immigration cases. During one visit, an individual held soft tears in his eyes when he told me, "This is by far the longest conversation I've had with someone in the past 2 years." We had spent 45 minutes talking about his time in solitary confinement and lack of medical care in the detention facility. He later shared that he contemplated suicide because it would be the only way his body would be buried with his family in the United States. He had immigrated from Central America with his parents at the age of 3. Now in his early 50s, he was said to be deported. "If I get deported," he said matter-of-factly, "I will get killed over there. Who will bury me? Who will I be buried with? I have no one there. Better to kill myself here where ICE will have to send my body to my parents." I imagine alternative endings to his story, one that doesn't involve him making a noose from the bedsheet in his prison cell or being killed by a gang member in his home country because his asylum claim was denied by an immigration judge. Indifference is both individual and societal. For him, at the individual level, it meant not having a meaningful conversation with someone for years and prison guards making fun of his mental illness. At the societal level, it meant languishing in abusive, inhumane conditions in a for-profit immigration detention facility before being sent to a country where he has no family and faces significant risk of harm and death. Part of a larger immigration prison system replete with physical brutality, sexual abuse, racist mistreatment, and a denial of due process. Just this past month, an 8-year-old girl died at the border while in US custody. Although she had a 104.5-degree fever, a nurse practitioner at the facility denied 4 requests from her mother to be taken to a hospital. When I tell people about the work I do, a common reaction is, wow, that's so depressing, or wow, that's so hard. I'm still trying to figure out the best response to those questions and those statements, but what I want to say is that the work isn't hard. In fact, it's inspiring. It infuses me with purpose. How can I not be inspired by the resiliency of the individuals that I serve? But what is hard is trying to convince people that the work matters, that people who may not look like them or speak like them or go on vacations with them or go to school with their children are worthy of attention, of money, of both individual and societal investment. In her book, Ethics in an Age of Terror and Genocide, Identity and Moral Choice, political psychologist Kristen Monroe, who I was lucky enough to work with, examined the responses of ordinary people during the Nazi Holocaust across 3 groups: Nazi supporters, rescuers, and bystanders. The bystanders chose indifference. A common response was, but what could I do? I was one person alone against the Nazis. The rescuers, on the other hand, saw themselves as connected with everyone else and able to effect change. So back to 2006. My fellow pre-med classmate had no idea there was genocide occurring in Darfur. I was devastated. I thought to myself, why bother to become a doctor if they can be so out of touch with human suffering around the world? But the following summer, I was actually lucky enough to intern for Physicians for Social Responsibility, which, as many of you know, was founded by Dr. Lown to address the threat of nuclear war. As Dr. Lown explained at that time, the real death threat in the world was not cardiac, but nuclear. How could I be a doctor and close my eyes to this overwhelming reality? And it was during this internship that for the first time I saw and learned about examples of physicians like Dr. Lown who combined their passion for medicine with human rights advocacy. It was those role models and others who gave me the inspiration and confidence to do the work that I do. Even now, I actively seek out their stories. Within the example of physician advocates and leaders, we can find a path that can crack the indifference wall, reminding ourselves not only of our own power, often our collective power, but also our connection to others and ability to empathize with distant situations and sorrows and joys. One of my favorite poets is Palestinian-American Naomi Shihab Nye, and in a poem titled History, she asks about what did we do to one another on a planet so wide open for doing? I hope that, like Dr. Lown, I too will inspire other physicians to remember that in this planet so wide open for doing, our doing must extend beyond our individual patients to ensure justice for people everywhere. That our doing must be used to nurture hope as an antidote to complacency, complicity, and injustice. And that our doing must above all else take stock of the reality of our interconnectedness with one another. Thank you. Thank you.